Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Heather. I'm a junior consultant at Turner and Townsend and working as part of the Learning and Development team on the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator, or SHRA. Today, I'm joined by Sarah Daly, an associate director at Turner and Townsend, who is going to deliver her presentation on embedding social value within retrofit projects. I do ask that you keep your cameras off and microphones muted throughout the presentation, but if you do have any questions at all, please pop them into the chat function and we will be able to revisit these following the presentation during the Q&A session, where we will encourage your use of microphones and cameras just to get some good discussion going. This event is being recorded and the recording will be made available following the event in an email to all attendees. You're also able to find a clean recording of this masterclass along with all of our other content on the resources section of the SHRA website. You can find that at socialhousingretrofit.org.uk. I will be posting all of these useful links within the chat just so you have ease of access to those. At the end of today's session, I will be popping an electronic feedback form in the chat via a link. I do ask that you just take a wee moment to fill this out. It just helps us to understand how you're finding these sessions and maybe areas where we can further develop content. So really beneficial to all of you and to us as well. So I'll now pass over to Sarah to take you through the presentation and I'll join you again for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Heather. Very smoothly done there. We're having a few tech gremlins, so I'll just warn you that for some odd reason I couldn't load up the presentation. So Heather's very kindly going to be my pilot and take me through it today. So if we move to the next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of today's agenda then, as Heather said, I'm Sarah Daly and I'm an Associate Director here at over the last probably 8 months now, 9 months nearly, on this learning and development programme for SHRA. The social value side is actually really exciting. So today we're going to look at what social value is, the importance of embedding it in your projects, achieving community benefits, again, really important, engaging with the supply chain, equality, diversity and inclusion, how social value is measured, and a couple of case studies. And most importantly, of course, what you can do. So we're not going to be too prescriptive about, how you might take social value forward. The idea here is that we get to a stage where you almost become inspired by the topic and can start developing out your own ideas around it, really. Okay. So in terms of what social value is then, it's pretty much summed up really by the little Venn diagram that we've got there with social value in the middle. So we've got really a culmination of working with communities, real estate and the built environment and local authorities all coming together to try and really, as I tend to call it, get more bang for the buck. So the idea behind it is that we're quantifying non-financial values in monetary terms. And that means to say, in terms of what might be happening within a sort of wider programme, how can you actually leverage every pound that is spent to get that sort of wider community benefit? Now, the really important thing about this is I think sometimes people feel a little bit as if it's just another thing, another box to tick, something else they've got to do. But in fact, I like to call that bit in the middle the sweet spot, because once you get into that sweet spot, you really start to get, it's almost like the thing that makes you get up in the morning and go to work, because all the other things that you have to do can often be quite process driven, but suddenly you get involved in an area where you can really see what a difference you can make. And as we know, most people actually want to have that real sense of their own payback in their job. And that's really what social value does for you and your organisation and those within your teams. Next slide. Thank you. So the importance of embedding social value. Well, I suppose, there's an obvious point there about, being able to ensure that you've got social and environmental return on investment. So unless you actually set it up in a formalised way, it's the old adage, isn't it? If you don't measure it, you can't monitor it or manage it. So you have to sort of take the same strategic approach really to social and environmental ROI as you would to any other return on investment. But where we get into a really interesting area here is that obviously, if we're talking about retrofit as social housing, it's implicit that it's got some social value in it anyway, isn't it? Because we're talking about taking people out of fuel poverty and making their homes more comfortable and their energy more affordable and all of those really important things. But social value beyond that is really what we're talking about. So we're saying, how do you get beyond the sort of immediate value that we're getting from these sorts of projects into something that's actually going to have a broader lasting legacy? And it's really interesting when you start looking at I suppose this sort of concept around government funded projects, because if you just spend £1 billion on something, then £1 billion has been spent. If you spend £1 billion and you consciously try and make 10 or 20% of that have that added social value in it, then it's almost a multiplier of that £1 billion back into the market. So that's really what we're looking at. So yes, you can do things like support the local economy and create new employment opportunities, and they can be for residents, or it could be for other community groups. And it's really important, of course, to get this whole sort of EDI agenda included as well, because again, it's one of the areas where you can get that bang for the buck, in a very sort of intense way. And of course, we've mentioned some of the things like, taking people out of fuel poverty, but there are lots of other ways that you can improve the health and well-being of local residents as well, often by getting them involved in other sorts of programmes. So it all comes down really to this particular act, which is the Public Services Social Value Act of 2012. You may or may not have heard of it. It's obviously 10 years ago now. We should really be very familiar with it. But what actually happened was it got released as an Act of Parliament, but hasn't really been mandated until January 2021, when the government started paying a lot more attention to what was being done within the social value side of things. And now, even if your own organisation hasn't really started to engage with it, you'll find more and more where there's any sort of public spending involved, there will be mandated social value aspects to that. And the SHDF fund is no different. So in the application process, you will need to demonstrate that you have a social value policy, that you've got a social value strategy, and within the projects that you're talking about here, exactly how you're going to deploy it in relation to that Act of Parliament. So there's all sorts of ways that you can achieve community benefits through retrofit projects. So on the delivery side, we mentioned local residents, where you can recruit people in to actually work on projects. So particularly if you've got perhaps a larger scheme that's going to happen in a particular community area that you can identify, it might be that you can actually start promoting with your supply chain the opportunity for people to get involved in direct employment on the projects that are going to be happening on their patch. So that's a really powerful thing to do for a start. You can imagine you get into sort of super resident engagement once you get to that side of things. Offering work experience placements and apprenticeships. So often, and obviously particularly in some of the more difficult communities, there are a lot of needs. There are a lot of opportunities to engage with some of those hard to reach groups, and again, getting them involved in things that are going to be happening within their own community might be a way of leveraging them back into their workplace or into training in a way that they might not have been interested if it was something that they didn't see as actually having any direct relevance to them or their community. And it's often an interesting one because I think, again, hard-pressed managers are thinking, I can't do all of this. I can barely sort of manage my own projects and people. But you can operate these projects through, there are plenty of charities and not-for-profit organisations around who will actually facilitate that community engagement. And you can work with those groups to actually, if you'd like to, the heavy lifting on the programmes. Then you get to the scoping side. So, what sort of things might you want to include? Well, again, the really important thing here is to deep dive into what that community might want. And I was talking to a colleague recently who had a really interesting perspective on this and said, in every community there's a Marge or a Harry or a Bob or a Jill or somebody who's like the hub in the community, who people go to, who's they may have started off as the neighbourhood busybody, but they soon sort of segued into a much more sort of useful role in their local communities. And they're often the people who become that interface between, various other authorities and groups, either directly through the local authority or the housing association, or they might be the sort of people who, make projects happen on the ground. They're the ones who'll sort out reclaiming a bit of wasteland and making it into a garden, or any number of different sort of projects. So a lot of it comes down to sort of real local knowledge, knowing who those people are, knowing who the facilitators are, knowing who the active groups are. So again, it isn't about doing something very superficial. It's about getting right in there, understanding what the local problems are or what the opportunities are, and then really working through with those so that there's a real deep sense of collaboration happening. So that's the sort of stuff we're talking about. We're not talking about throwing a bit of volunteer days from your own staff into a local community, or painting some play equipment or something. We're talking about a sort of long-term deep engagement with the community groups, where a little bit of extra resource or funding could make a huge difference to their ability to deliver social value in their own community. And again, we've got the planning side of things. So within the planning process, the idea is that the Social Value Act will effectively be deploying something like another £15 billion a year of value for communities across the UK. So, that's, there we are in terms of bang for the buck. We're talking about billions of pounds that can be, really utilised. So one of the really interesting, I love this case study. So One Manchester, Erneley Close, you might have come across it before, because the case studies sadly are a bit thin on the ground at the moment. So I'm hoping we've got a great cohort here who are going to be next year's case studies. But this was a really interesting one because it was a large scale passive house retrofit. It was one of those problematic estates. It was there were all sorts of issues around the community not interacting, lots of issues around vandalism and poor quality sort of housing, and it had all the issues you might expect with an unloved, uncared for estate. But by going about this in the right way, and certainly in terms of supporting and almost engineering that sort of social value part of it, it got to the stage where the community moved from where there were lots of I should have the before picture actually here, because if you didn't know the site before, there were lots of sort of individual little bits of unloved garden, but actually it was made into a communal space and landscaped, and the local community were then able to take responsibility over time for their own space. And so all sorts of lovely things happened, like hosting barbecues and all of the sort of things that happen again when you get that sort of coalescence of a local community. And there are real return on investments there for the landlord as well, because for some of you who might have come across the report that Sustainable Homes did some years ago, during my time there actually, a report called what was it called? Do you know, it's gone out of my head now. Something the Void. Anyway, I'll come back in a second. But that report was a really interesting one because it actually monetised the benefit to social landlords of better performing properties, and that included things like less likelihood of the properties being void or being people care for their properties much more. So again, you don't have those additional costs and management costs of dealing with problematic tenants. People it's a cliche, isn't it? But put somebody in a decent home and very often they will be the sort of people touching the voids. Thank you, Heather. Very often the residents, the same cohort of residents put into different housing will behave very differently. So again, it's about this whole sort of thing of looking holistically at those people in the communities and not just saying we're doing a technical retrofit and upgrade session here. We're actually talking about something that's much more deep rooted. So yeah, this is what we need. This is really what we're aiming for. We're aiming for that sweet spot of saying, well, we've spent the money, we've reached the standards that were expected of these properties, but this is the bonus. We've actually now got a really cohesive community and lots of very demonstrable benefits that have come out of the additional social value that's been knitted into the project. So in terms of engaging with the supply chain, obviously vitally important, because the suppliers very often are the ones who have to do the heavy lifting here. As you'll probably know, you can apply for funding, but if you've got a range of suppliers who are required to deliver the projects, then you will probably want to embed those criteria into their requirements as well. And you'll probably be aware there'll be some organisations who are all over this. They know exactly what needs to be done, and they're already on it or ahead of the game. There'll be many others who don't even know what this means, and you're pretty much going to have to start from scratch with them. So it's really important to start thinking yourselves about what you want to get out of your supply chain and what you want to get out of your programmes. Organise events, engage particularly with SMEs and micro businesses and those family run businesses, and with as much community relation as you can, because again they'll be the ones who'll get really excited about delivering that added value for you. You will have to be quite strategic in terms of the way that you build social value into the tender evaluation, into the criteria and scoring, but really what you're effectively doing is saying, once you've enabled them to do what you need them to do, then there has to be a mechanism by which you can manage and monitor what they're doing, because you will be required to report back on, I think it's a quarterly basis, but that might change for future bid windows. But the BEIS basically require you to be able to report back on what you've done in social value directly and indirectly for the duration of the programme. So it's really important that that's actually structured effectively. You could suggest a short list of social value outcomes in the tender that you want to achieve. You might have already decided what you think could or should be done in that area, and you might want to direct everybody in the same way, or you might want to have a more open approach to it. But whichever way you go about it, you do need to make your own strategy clear. And obviously it's really important to make sure that there's that collaborative approach all the way through. So it can't be, if you impose it on somebody and say, right, you must do this and you've got to do this amount of, employ this many people or do this amount of days in the community or whatever it is you want to do, it won't happen. It'll be the sort of thing that gets left to the end, and then there'll be a bit of a panic and somebody will be cobbling something together to try and tick that box, and that's not what we want. We want that early engagement and really get people excited and fired up about what this all means. But the last point to make there, which is really important, of course, is that these initiatives can come at a cost. I mean, it doesn't have to be. It could be an indirect cost, or it could be a displacement of other costs. But if there is going to be a cost involved, just make sure you factor it into your budget, particularly if there's something that might need to happen, like regeneration of a bit of land around the properties or whatever. That could obviously run into quite a lot of money, and you need to build it into your plan. I'm probably going to have to speed up a little bit now because we're only halfway through. So in terms of ED&I, I mean, a really interesting little chart here, because it kind of helps you really to sort of understand the different aspects that you might need to address within your programme. We've actually got a separate masterclass on EDI, so you can either look at our forward schedules, which are about to be put in place for April onwards. They're not actually live at the moment. We're just having a little hiatus before we get that programme moving. But in the absence of that, do go to the recorded masterclasses and just pick up the EDI one. And again, it's great to share. This one's a recorded masterclass as well, and others that you can then use with other colleagues, and again, get everyone onto the same page. So the important thing about things like EDI, again, is inclusive design for all. So what does that mean on a community basis? You might have to think about different groups that you're engaging with. What happens with elderly or vulnerable patients, or people with physical or mental disabilities? What happens with different ethnicities? All of those sorts of things can be brought into your programme. And also you might want to just sort of consider the different life stages of your project and how you will then relate that. So there might be an ebb and flow there. And within your organisation, so you need that representative distribution of protected characteristics. Very jargony, but I'm sure you've all had training in this area, where you just need to make sure that you're trying to employ as diverse a range of people as you can. And again, you embed EDI into your organisation and programming, and make sure you collect that baseline data. So then we get into, how social value is measured. Now, this is a really, again, fascinating area. It's not the most exact of sciences, if we're honest about it, but one of the most popular that's used certainly within the public sector is TOMS, which is based on theme, outcome, and measures. So I won't read through the chart here, but you can see, you can sort of, set out on the left-hand side what your themes are, and they can either be very general or very specific. You can then break that down into a range of outcomes that you might expect to come out of that particular programme, and then obviously you need some way of measuring. And this is a very sort of simplistic way, really, because again, if you sit around with a group of people, it's the sort of thing that's very easy to do in quite a short period of time, with a whiteboard and some post-it notes and a few ideas flying around over a cup of tea and a soggy sandwich. Most people can crack out some really good ideas. So it doesn't have to be a very long and painful and arduous process. Most people actually have, and particularly I'm sure as all of you are very related already to the communities that you might want to help, you'll probably know pretty quickly what sort of things you can do and what you might want to encourage in your neighbourhoods. So in terms of other ways of looking at it, some organisations, and particularly, maybe more so at local authority level, like to orientate themselves to the Sustainable Development Goals. So many will already have that as a mechanism, and that can be used as a social value tool. It's not quite so formalised, but there are ways of taking the relevant SDGs that relate to your organisation and then actually following those through the next level of principles that you get once you dig into the SDGs themselves. HACT have got that lovely diagram in the middle, so the roadmap for social value in social housing. So again, really interesting in terms of just giving you that sort of sense of how the different sort of relations or different aspects sort of interrelate with each other and how that can be delivered in a programmatic and very systematic approach. So that's when you start getting slightly more formalised. And we've just mentioned the TOMS measurement framework, which again is very often favoured by public sector organisations. So we're not going to go into any detail of those particularly now, but it's just important that you know which are around. If you've got other people in your organisation who are already responsible for social value, perhaps social value, corporate social value, as opposed to project social value, it's very important again to engage with them and maybe see what they're using and see if you can dovetail your programme with what they're already doing, and that helps to keep everything nice and neat and joined up. I really like this as well. So the Construction Innovation Hub have actually created a value toolkit. So again, if you Google Construction Innovation Hub and value toolkit, you'll get straight to it. But again, it gives you that sort of sense of the structure around the different aspects. And the idea here is with this sort of spidergram approach is that you can plot where you are now and then where you might want to be, or you might plot, how existing programs are operating, whatever, and that will help you to see where perhaps you need to slightly redistribute the effort if it's not as balanced as you might want, or it might be exactly the balance you want in order to hit certain targets. So again, a really useful way of approaching that sort of systemizing, if you like, of what you're going to do within social value. So we mentioned earlier about the case study, and this is I suppose that, once you start getting to these sort of outcomes and measures, a really good example, I suppose, to show you how you can take that through to things, the monetization. So you obviously have the non-financial aspects of social value, but here what happened with the One Manchester project, and I actually think it happened retrospectively. I don't think they actually started this process before or during the programme. I think they actually started measuring it afterwards. But the idea was they wanted to map what the consequential benefits would be of different approaches. So you can see the indicators of what they've classified as their social values on the left, and they've looked at what would happen with a decent homes retrofit programme versus the passive house programme. and then they've actually been able to create that into a monetized value. So that's a really good example, because really as a sector, and most broadly across all public sector spending, really all public spending, we really need to get to understand some sort of common values that can be applied to things. You know, we know, I was doing a project recently actually for the police and crime commissioners, and it was actually about they were deploying a percentage of their fund into environmental upgrades in their most troublesome areas, particularly when they knew there was a lot of youth crime. And they were able to measure as well what the return on investment was in terms of crime reduction in those areas where they were able to engage with, you know, young people who were effectively on ASBOs. So, you know, those sorts of things can be done, but that would then require partnering with the police if that was one of your indicators. So you need to know, you know, again, where you're going to benchmark and how you're going to identify that. But bear in mind, the police and crime commissioners in this particular instance put hundreds of thousands of pounds of their own budget into the programme. So there we have another example of something where, and I'm sure the same would happen on mental well-being, it might be there's a primary care trust to actually say, do you know what, we know there's rising depression rates or anxiety rates, whatever, in this particular community, what can we do with you to help bring some of those people in, and then we can measure what the decline is in their requirement for medical intervention as a result of being involved in this programme. So they're the sorts of things we're talking about. So it's sort of, you know, you've got the layer of specific interventions which are getting the properties to the performance level they need to be at from a technical point of view, and then we've got this lovely sort of social value layer on there, which is actually providing all of that extra added value. I'd say that's the bit that makes me go goosebumpy, because, you know, nobody gets too excited about external wall insulation, do they? So this is the happy spot. Okay, so what can you do? Well, loads and loads of things, and if anything there might be too much, which is why I go back to this, you know, try and maybe have a brainstorm session. But you could, if you don't already know, identify pro-social companies who are on your patch. If you're a large organisation, you might cover a lot of square miles, or, you know, hundreds or thousands, or maybe even across, you know, have properties dispersed across the whole of the UK. So whatever it is, it might be that you have to sort of reach out to other colleagues in other areas to help you do this mapping exercise. Some of the sort of very obvious areas that often happen are things like encouraging returnships, return to work programs, which can be, you know, for women or any carers, to be honest, they don't have to be female. But again, those sorts of initiatives tend to be some of the sort of immediate go-to ones, because they can be bundled up quite well. Promoting can't speak today. Promoting apprenticeships, again, especially targeting those minority and disadvantaged backgrounds, can be really important. So this is about then again mapping those communities and looking at them and saying, okay, what is, so we know there's already a very poor correlation in the construction sector across different ethnic groups, but if you're doing a project in an area that has a particularly high proportion of a particular ethnicity, is that being represented, and what do you need to do to engage and actually facilitate that process? And again, that might mean partnering with FE colleges or other groups who might already have programmes on the ground that you can just tap into, and you can say, look, you're trying to get them trained, we've got some employment here, and hey presto, the two come together and you've got something really powerful. You can also choose suppliers who work with ex-offenders. There's all sorts of programmes going on around the country with that. Some of them are actually working with offenders. So there's projects, I think there's one up near Liverpool where they're actually doing MMC projects, sort of housing projects with a particular prison. So, you know, those skills can then be moved out into the community. So again, find out what's happening in those sort of areas. And very often you've got people there who are desperate to actually get into a long-term secure employment. So again, they can have really strong paybacks. So I won't go through the other two there, but you know, effectively the bottom line there is you need need demonstrable social value targets per pound spent. So how do you do that? How do you actually say, this is our total budget, this is what we want to get, you know, the real increased benefit out of, and quantify that to set your initial targets, and then obviously develop your processes for managing and monitoring that through the programme. So, you know, the bottom line here is, you know, we all see these wonderful programs, don't we, where you think, oh my goodness, how on earth have we got to this situation where, you know, somebody deaf is dancing to music? You know, we've got, you know, somebody who's got a, you know, major physical disability who's, you know, dancing on ice. I mean, there's just so many amazing, inspiring examples out there. But basically, we've got to take this out of TV land and then put it back into our everydays. You know, where are the people in our local communities who have the ability to shine and to, you know, be those real heroes and heroines on our projects. So it shouldn't just be about Saturday and Sunday night TV. We've got to kind of make, you know, these wonderful moments happen in real life too. So we've got a few references here. So when you get the this presentation through the slides, you'll be able to sort of follow some of those links through. And I know Heather has been very efficiently dropping some into the chat as well. So you should have plenty of resources to go for there. And I think that's pretty much it for today. So we'll just do the questions.